Don't you just love the poet Rilke? Well, of course, I'm talking about the famous German poet Rainer Maria Rilke, born in 1875, died at only 51 years old in 1926. One of the most important poets of the 20th century, who remains incredibly popular today, is read all over the world. His work has been translated into so many different languages. Uh, but why is that? Why is he so loved and read to this day? Well, that is the perfect question for the podcast Poetry, Passion, and Pleasure with your host, Dale Byron. That's me. This is the place where we specialize in everyday, practical, I call it hitch it up to your life poetry. And so, welcome to all. So, let's jump right in. Rilke, I think, helps us in a down to earth, very practical way to do some very important things. One, to see life freshly. His work, his poems, I think, help us see the world in a very fresh way. Also helps us to feel the joy of living, and conversely, to grieve and to heal from those things which we need to grieve and heal from, and also to celebrate. And this, very importantly, I think, with Rilke's work, celebrate the essential, the essence, the mystery of this uh, experience that we call life. So let's jump right in with one of his poems, and we'll focus on mostly translations by the amazing poet Robert Bly, amazing American poet. I find that I love Robert Bly's translations of the original German, of course, that Rilke's poems were written in. This one is called I Live My Life, this first poem. I live my life in growing orbits which move out over the things of the world. Perhaps I can never achieve the last, but that will be my attempt. I am circling around God, around the ancient tower, and I have been circling for 1,000 years, and I still don't know if I am a falcon or a storm or a great song. And I still don't know if I am a falcon or a storm or a great song. You know, this is a great example, I think, in this of the kinds of work that Rilke is famous for. When I think about these confrontations with the great mystery that we call I, one of my mentors uh, and friends, Brother David Steindl-Rast, used to use the expression that when we say I myself, we are saying something bigger than just I or myself. I myself. He would say that there are uncountable I's that go along with this one universal self. I, the unique manifestation of each of us, and then the self representing this oneness, which of course is everything. It reminded me, this poem, also of some very poetic lines by the great poet E. E. Cummings. He said, "We are so both and oneful." Don't you love that line? We are so both and oneful. Night cannot be so sky. Sky cannot be so sunful. I am through you, so I. Let's do that one more time. I am through you, so I. We are co emerging in this universe. We are together. I am through you, so I. Um, I was thinking also when you think about a poem like this, and when you're looking for yourself, when you're looking for both your many potential eyes and then your one great self, um, or we could say, or your soul. How do you do that? How do you do that? Well, my note says that one way we do that is we turn to art, we turn to nature, we turn to mythic stories, and we turn to great poems, just like these Rilke poems. And what pattern do we need, in other words, that reflects the I myself, the the smaller I, and then this great self which we all inhabit. You know, language falls away in the face of mystery. That's why poems reach toward. Poems are able oftentimes to say what language can't say. Wonderful paradox. I am circling around God, around the ancient tower, and I've been circling for 1,000 years, and I still don't know if I am a falcon or a storm or a great song. Okay, let's keep cooking. Um, Here's another translation, another poem and translation by Robert Bly. And I've loved this particular poem for a long time. I hope you will too. My life is not this steeply sloping hour. My life is not this steeply sloping hour in which you see me hurrying. Much stands behind me. I stand before it like a tree. And I am only one of many mouths, and at that, the one that will be still the soonest. I am the rest between two notes, which are somehow always in discord, because death's note wants to climb over. But in the dark interval, reconciled, but in the dark interval, reconciled. They stay there trembling, and the song goes on beautiful. Now, I don't think I've mentioned yet, but if you look over my shoulder, um, well, I guess it's both shoulders, you see a hotel back there and a beautiful place. And if you look over one of my shoulders, you see a statue of none other than the great poet Rilke. Now, this happens to be located, the statue in the hotel happens to be located in a town in Spain called Ronda. I had the great privilege to go there and visit this past year, spend some time in Ronda, and it was bigger than life for me. It was amazing. This was a place in Spain um, that Rilke spent a lot of time. He spent a lot of time in that hotel, and he also spent a lot of time with one of his patrons that helped um, with money for Rilke, helped sponsor him, his livelihood as he wrote. And he broke a great writer's block in Ronda. And it's a beautiful, beautiful place. But I just wanted to point that out. I had to use that as my backdrop today. Um, I just, I love this poem. Somebody made the kind of a joke. They said, this would be a great poem to memorize. And if you dropped, let's say you're in a grocery store and you dropped some things on the floor that you were carrying, and as you were picking them up, you could look up and you could look at someone across the aisle and say, my life is not this steeply sloping hour in which you see me hurrying. So it could be very practical in so many ways. Don't you just love this, though? That image, my life is not this steeply sloping hour in which you see me hurrying. How many times in our modern, contemporary, meta modern world, do we have the feeling of being on a steeply sloping hour? Uh, and then he goes on and he says toward the end of the poem, I am the rest between two notes which are somehow always in discord because death's note wants to climb over. But in the dark interval, reconciled, they stay there trembling, and the song goes on beautiful. There are times when we need to be reminded, I think, that the difficulties and the joys and the beautiful things and the most difficult things all show up together. And yet, as Rilke says, and the song goes on beautiful. This is why when I talk about, as I have a lot on this podcast and in my work, I talk about the need for first aid poetry. And I'm actually working on a piece, an essay about that. And poetry can be many things, but it can be a first aid that can help us bring ourselves back when we are in difficult straits. And this is one of those poems which I think belongs in our poetry first aid kit. Um, there's a quote that I wrote down from Rilke that I wanted to bring. He says, live the questions now. Perhaps you will then gradually, without noticing it, live along some distant day into the answer. There's so much wisdom in that. Live the questions now. Can we just live the question? Can we, um, there's a book that Alan Watts wrote, the philosopher Alan Watts, The Wisdom of Uncertainty, I think is what he called it. So can we live in the question? Because as Rilke is saying, perhaps you will then gradually, without noticing it, live along some distant day into the answer. Because if we tried to live the answer too soon, I think he goes on to say later in that piece, I think this is from Letters to a Young Poet, um, it's an amazing piece of work in and of itself. But he goes on to say that if we try to live an answer too soon, we won't be able to do it because our body, our psyche, our soul, our mind is not ready. So here's a quote that I wrote down. It's been said that Rilke's poetry resonates with readers because of its emotional depth, its universal themes, the beauty of the language, the philosophical depths, and mystical quality. Well, I cannot speak German, and so the way I know Rilke's poems are through English translations. And what's wild to me is how the beauty of the language even comes through the translation. Now, this has, in many ways, to do with the skill of the translator, in this case, Robert Bly, the ones that we've done so far, which amazing skill. But isn't it interesting how the music of a poem it's so good, it's so amazing that it comes through even in translations. Um, this writer goes on to say, talking about Rilke, his works offer a powerful and profound exploration of the human experience that speaks to people across generations and cultures. And I know that, boy, that is so true. It's been true for me. One little quick story I wanted to tell you is that I had the great privilege, and I think I've probably mentioned this somewhere on the podcast before, certainly mentioned it in my work and talks I've done. I had the great privilege of working with and having another mentor who was Margot Frazier, who happened to be the founder of Birkenstock USA, which was an amazing company. Margot was an amazing human being. And the very first meeting that I had with Margot, which preceded our working together for over a decade in the company Birkenstock, and then after she retired and so on and so forth, we maintained a relationship for well, essentially the rest of her life. She just passed about 4 or 5 years ago, as I recall. So, but in this first meeting that I was talking about, what I love to say is that we talked about business for, oh, I don't know, about 15 minutes of the 45-ish hour long meeting that we had. The whole rest of the time we talked about poetry. That's when I had first gotten smitten, or at least it was only a couple of years, some obviously a lot of years ago, or it was a lot of years ago. And I had just become smitten with poetry, fallen in love with poetry, adult onset poetry syndrome, I call it. And so we had a wonderful conversation, and I found out that she absolutely loved the German poet Rilke. In fact, Margot grew up in Germany, and and her family got trapped in Germany during World War II. You can just imagine how that was. And her father had great instinct, so he was able to keep them safe and moving about inside the country. But at any rate, she said that the poet Rilke saved her life as a teenager in World War II, being in Germany. So that's always been, it's an amazing story. So I mentioned that this hotel is right behind right behind me, is called the Hotel Reina Victoria, which was built in 1906 and is located in the heart of Rwanda. I know that to be true. I walked all around the streets there and all around this hotel. By the way, just on facing this hotel is facing a canyon. If you go and look online at some pictures of Rhonda, you'll see this great canyon which the whole city is sort of organized around, and it is just incredibly gorgeous. But that's what the hotel faces. Um, and at the time of Rilke's stay, the hotel was known as the Hotel Rhonda, and it was a popular destination for artists and writers. And there's a lot of famous people that live there or visited there. Rilke spent a significant amount of time in Rwanda from 1912 to 1913, where he wrote some of his most famous works. During his time in Rwanda, Rilke lived in a villa called Villa Simbroni, where he was a guest of Princess Maria von Thurn. And he just wrote an incredible amount of poetry. And he attributes the success of his breaking through his writer's block, which had lasted for a number of years, with the beauty of that town, Rilke, and the time he spent there. Okay, let's keep cooking. We're trying to give examples of why people, remember our title, don't you just love Rilke? Why do people love Rilke? Why do they keep reading his work? Now, it's been almost 100 years since he died in 1926. This is called the archaic torso of Apollo. Yes, again, the archaic torso of Apollo by Rilke. We cannot know his legendary head. We cannot know his legendary head with eyes like ripening fruit, and yet his torso is still suffused with brilliance from inside. Like a lamp, in which his gaze, now turned to low, gleams in all its power. Otherwise, the curved breasts could not dazzle you so, nor could a smile run through the placid hips and thighs to that dark center where procreation flared. Otherwise, otherwise, this stone would seem defaced beneath the translucent cascade of the shoulders, and would not glisten like a wild beast's fur, would not from all the borders of itself, would not from all the borders of itself burst like a star. For here there is no place that does not see you. For here there is no place that does not see you. You must change your life. You must change your life. You just imagine that when Rilke was writing this poem, you can just imagine that he got to that last part of the poem and shocked himself with what he would say and what he did say. You know, I've talked about this before, the idea that if the uh, poet, said Ezra Pound, if the poet is not surprised, then the reader will not be either. And so there's an element where the words, the muse, however you want to say it, call the writing out. And oftentimes, in fact, with the best poems, I think the poet is shocked, surprised, surprised. Because what comes through the language is more than language. We talked about that a little bit earlier. Poems can say what language cannot say. And so I can't know this for certain, but I can imagine that when, you know, this piece of work that he's studying and staring at, that it is the level of beauty and perfection is such that um, you know, that he says, here there is no place that does not see you. So we are being seen in a complete, full way. And the conclusion is, you must change your life. You know, I say that a good poem, a great poem, a magnificent piece of art poem is one that allows us to step inside and have our own experience. And I think these poems, particularly this last one that I just read, um, are so rich with that capacity to have us step inside, you know, and just be taken to our own place, that we make it our poem. We hear it. You know, it's the wonderful thing about poetry. You make it your poem by walking inside and having your experience. Of course, the poet sets some parameters, put some words on a piece of paper, some very amazing words. But you complete the poem. We complete the poem when we step inside and have our own experience. That's what I think makes great poetry great, or one of many things. Um, I have I have a quote by Rilke that I wanted to tag on to the end of this poem, called, it says, don't be too quick to draw conclusions from what happens to you. Simply let it happen. Almost has kind of Buddhist overtones there. Anyway, let's move on to our last poem. Don't you just love Rilke? Okay, this is another very famous poem, and it is. Oh, by the way, that last poem that I spoke, the archaic torso of Apollo, that was Stephen Mitchell was the translator there. Different than all the other poems, but I just want to point that out. Very important. Now we're back to Robert Bly for this last poem. and it's called Sometimes a Man Stands Up During Dinner. Very short little poem. Sometimes a man stands up during dinner and walks outdoors and keeps on walking because of a church that stands somewhere in the east. And his children say blessings on him as if he were dead. And another man who remains inside his own house dies there, inside the dishes and in the glasses, so that his children have to go far out into the world toward that same church which he forgot, which he forgot. Sometimes a man stands up during supper and walks outdoors and keeps on walking because of a church that stands somewhere in the east. And his children say blessings on him as if he were dead. And another man, and another man, and another man who remains inside his own house dies there, inside the dishes and in the glasses, so that his children have to go far out into the world toward that same church which he forgot. Might we have a quest that we must make, is how I was thinking about this. Or if we do not, then others we love will have to make that quest, go on that quest, complete that quest. And at any minute, someone we love could stand up, or we could stand up, or we ourselves could stand up. And either way, everything in our lives is going to change because of that. Or if there's some quest that is destined, so someone is going to go on that quest one way or another. This poem asks so many juicy questions. Remember, we talked about you walk inside the poem and you have your own experience. This poem becomes your poem. Sometimes a man stands up during dinner and walks outdoors and keeps on walking because of a church that stands somewhere in the east, and his children say blessings on him as if he were dead. And another man who remains inside his own house dies there, inside the dishes and in the glasses, so that his children have to go far out into the world toward that same church, which he forgot. Now, please notice, or at least I would ask us to try and notice how that particular poem does not, I don't think any of these poems sort of beat us over the head with, this is the way we will get this poem. That's not what great poetry does for us. I don't think that's why Rilke is still beloved by so many people. I don't think that's why so many people still read his poetry, why he's so important in the world of poetry to this day, almost 100 years after his death. It is because he wrote poems that do all of those practical things for us, that help us see our lives more clearly, that help us ask really big questions that, that on one level need to be asked, good questions to ask to live a bigger life, a more full life. That's Rilke. That's Rilke, both amazing and mysterious and as practical as a glass of water when you're thirsty. That practical. Or a piece of bread when you're hungry. Okay, that's a wrap. Well, As I always say, if you have learned something new, if you have felt a sense of surprise, then I would love it if you would pass the podcast on to another colleague, friend, family member that you think might enjoy it. That'd be wonderful. I'd like to get more poetry out to the world. And as I always like to say, until next time and next poem or poems, please take good care of yourself.